Good day to you. Today we'll talk about flank attacks, with some examples of spectacularly successful flank attacks that literally broke up armies and dislocated them. In Figure 1, you see three basic flanking maneuvers. There are always variations on these, but in warfare, simplest is usually best and most effective. First, we see an example of envelopment. An attacker pins down the enemy's front, while another attacking force swings around and hits them from the side, or flank, hoping to dislocate them and send them running. Next, on the right, we see how an attacker positions themselves into a flanking position, which is similar to the former example. Instead of the attacker swinging rapidly into a position, they maneuver into that position. Then there's a double envelopment, which is the same as an envelopment maneuver, but hitting on both flanks. There's also higher level complexity involved. In Figure 2, we see a more modern method of a flanking maneuver. The supporting element is generally artillery with line of sight from an elevated position. They fire on the defender, who is wondering what is going on, and the moving element hits them from the flank. In Figure 3, the attacker is pretending to be on the defense to deceive the enemy, who promptly decides to advance, which is the worst thing they could do. On the right, two flanking elements hit from different sides, achieving at least a 2-to-1 manpower ratio. In Figure 4, it shows how concealment of intentions is crucial to success. Every successful flank attack that I've ever heard of has surprise on the side of the attacker. The woods, in this case, hide the movement to the flank, so the attacker will seem to appear out of nowhere. In Figure 5, it shows another example of a double envelopment. Complex maneuvers are never easy, but as we go back in time, it was harder than in modern times. Commanders would sit down at a map, which may not have been too accurate, and assign orders to lower level commanders. That was probably the last time that things were clear in everyone's minds. A lower level commander may find a hill that wasn't on the map, and then it disorients him. He gets off the path and faces the front of another section of the enemy army, and this is before a shot is even fired. Another example of rudimentary signals. In the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates fired a cannon in order to signal to General Lee that a flanking cavalry force was in the correct position, so he could launch Pickett's charge. In order to give an example of a successful flanking attack, I'll use the northern map portion of the real battlefield of Antietam. However, this example is purely fictitious and has nothing to do with the historical battle. This example is set in the Civil War, for simplicity's sake. There are two armies, the Blue Army and the Red Army. Before we begin, there is something that has to be understood. There is a difference between an army's overall strategy and what actually happens on the battlefield. One army, say the Blue Army, may have 130,000 men marching forward to destroy the Red Army. We could say the Blue Army's overall strategy is to find the enemy and attack. However, this may only last until the Blue Army reaches the battlefield and events overcome them. One perfect example of this is Union General Hooker before the Battle of Chancellorsville. He was maneuvering an army over twice the size of the Confederate army and led them over a major river to get into a good position. But a march does not equal a victory. Once Hooker crossed the river, he ordered his troops to entrench and wait for events. General Lee sensed what was going on and attacked with General Jackson in a flank attack, which we'll discuss later. This shows how the Blue Army is using movement to contact, which means that they are moving like a reconnaissance in force until they detect the enemy. Now this is generally not the wisest way of moving an army, but in reality it happens more often than it should. A runner runs breathlessly to the Blue Army commander's tent and announces that the enemy has been sighted. He immediately halts the army, sends out skirmishers in front of his formations, and goes to the front with his aides to assess the enemy dispositions. If daylight permits, he may order a unit to do a recon in force to ascertain where the enemy is. Since the Red Army has the heights, they probably already see the Blue Army. The Blue Army has half of its cavalry in the rear to protect the baggage trains and the route of possible retreat. The Blue Army establishes a line while placing the artillery on the 450-foot heights. The Red Army knows that they are in a strong defensive position. Even so, they analyze the Blue Army for a possible attack. The Red Army realizes that there are three obvious choices: attack the right flank, center, or rear. There is also a wide-swinging rear flank attack, which would be genius if it worked, but would be difficult and risky with Civil War armies. There generally is never a perfect geographic military position, and even if you found a great one and entrenched, the enemy may simply move away, and then your army would have to move away too. In the Civil War era, a river, hill, or mountain would be an ideal cover for a flank. You would be almost certain that an attack wouldn't come from that area. Therefore, you could focus on the center and on your other flank. If a flank had no natural boundary, then it was called up in the air. The reason why flank attacks sometimes work is that an army can't concentrate all its soldiers everywhere. There has to be areas where there are less of them. Sometimes it's best to attack the center, precisely because they expect you to attack the flank. Alexander the Great, at the Battle of Gaugamela, which defeated the Persian Empire, employed an unusual tactic. He rode his companion cavalry to the right flank in order to draw off the Persian cavalry. Then he attacked full force straight into a gap in the middle of the enemy line. This required almost perfect timing and maneuvering. The Red Army decides to redeploy its forces to launch an attack on the enemy's left flank and roll it up. The Red Army thins its line behind the fortifications and secretly moves its forces south. Although the Blue Army commander notices some movement south by the enemy, he cannot grasp what their intention is. At night, the Red Army lights many fires in the north, but none in the south. At dawn, the Red Army launches an all-out attack with a feint attack in the north to pin down those forces and to confuse the Blue Army commander about where the attack focus is. The modern German word for attack focus is Schwerpunkt. The feint in the middle is to ensure that the blue frontline troops aren't used to turn around to assist the flank defenders. After the successful flank attack, the Blue Army is in a difficult position. They have only a few options: stand and fight where they are, and die there. Try to break out to the rear, but this would be difficult or impossible because their troops are disorganized and broken up. Perhaps some could get across the river, but they would lose most of their equipment. Or they could surrender. Sometimes there are rear area reserves that can breach the Red Army long enough to allow some Blue Army troops to escape. But even in this best case scenario, the Blue Army would lose many troops, lose the battle, and be demoralized. This shows Confederate General Stonewall Jackson's famous flank attack. To the Federal forces looking on, it appeared that they were retreating from Catherine Furnace. The Confederates marched all day under cover of trees and back roads. General Jackson launched his 27,000-man flank attack. The Confederates fell upon the Union line, capturing 2 guns and routed General Leopold von Gilsa's German brigade. The 11th Corps was woefully unprepared for the attack. Howard, their commanding officer, was absent, and their entire reserve division was gone with him. Their defensive line was unprepared and facing the wrong direction, with both ends of the line unsecured or in the air. The nearest supporting troops were a mile away. With Confederates bursting upon their flank and rear, many Union soldiers had no option but to run for their lives. The shock was complete. The rout was on. General Jackson had reached the pinnacle of his success, of his fame, of his military glory. Another strategic flank attack on a massive scale was in France, May 1940. Bursting out of the Ardennes forest, the German army attacked toward the French coast, thereby surrounding the flower of the Allied forces. Speaking of the Battle of the Bulge, if you ever want to read about a wastage of good manpower, look up the Luftwaffe field divisions used in the Battle of the Bulge. A small American unit was able to hold off the Luftwaffe ground troops because the officers had no understanding of basic flanking maneuvers. They kept trying to charge the machine guns and paying with their lives in return, but that is another story. The French had considered the Ardennes impassable for a large army. This exact error was repeated by the United States Army in 1944 before the Battle of the Bulge. Later, most British soldiers retreated via Dunkirk. Most of the flanking tactics discussed have changed somewhat in modern times. The basic concepts are correct, but with the addition of satellite imagery, helicopters, air superiority, fuel logistics, armored infantry carriers, and advanced missiles and weaponry, tactics have changed. The only constant is change. The quality of soldier has much to do with this too. An airborne soldier is used to being surrounded, so it doesn't disturb him in the least. However, a massive army would not last long if surrounded, due to supply logistics. So even though some things change, sometimes in a major way on a small scale, when it comes to larger armies, they still need a regular resupply to be an effective fighting force. If you liked what you see, hit the subscribe button or share. Thank you. This has been EmersusTech.